take over Greenland in some other way. So this is a kind of maybe William McKinley or Theodore Roosevelt point of view, although I would say that Theodore Roosevelt said, speak softly but carry a big stick. Trump speaks very loudly, maybe doesn't have such a big stick, we don't know, but it's what he is swinging at is very loud, but maybe a lot of noise as well. When it comes to the Caribbean, there's a lot of reason for concern, of course, because Trump does not draw the line at U.S. borders. Another aspect of Trump's neo-imperialism, if I could call it this, at least rhetorical neo-imperialism, is the deep anti-migrant sentiment, which is a core part of Trump's political base inside the United States electorate. And so the deportation of people, this will go on. Trump has not, as far as I know, but the ambassador will know much better than I, and other panelists will know much better than I, directed his attention towards the Caribbean per se, but he's already done his best to alienate our two land contiguous neighbors, Canada and Mexico. And I'm sure that there will be demands on the Caribbean as well. He will tend to view security issues in a military way, that if there's violence or gangs or drug trafficking, that's all the fault of other countries, say Caribbean countries, not the fault of the United States, and so forth. So this is not going to be an easy period at all. We can add in the trade barriers, because Trump is really an avowed protectionist. As an economist, I'd say it's very bad economics, but it is good politics in the very short term, not in the long term, but in the short term. It won him votes in our industrial Midwest swing states to blame things on Mexico, to blame things on China, to blame things on the migrants. Of course, this is not real economics, but it does work politically. But he will raise tariffs, he'll make trade barriers, he'll complicate life for the Caribbean, no doubt. Now, what can the Caribbean do? Indeed. Well, at a minimum, countries need to hang together in CARICOM. This is minimum. Second, I believe that CELAC, the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, needs to play a much larger role than it has played in the past. This is not simple in Latin America and the Caribbean in general, because there are big differences. The U.S. also manipulates a lot of the processes, but I believe that CELAC is really important. I think Mexico becomes much more important for regional diplomacy than in the past. Unfortunately, there's a very, very smart leader in Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, and I think Mexico and the Caribbean have a lot of constructive dealings ahead. So this is how I would summarize things.
On the 1st of February, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he actually said and suggests that President Trump is paying closer attention to the Caribbean and other regions, and suggesting that they're going to stand together with our regional partners. Despite, of course, we know the attack on the citizenship by birthright policy. But interestingly, he talks specifically around Latin America. So he talks about the fact that focusing on mutual priorities, and I quote this, will bolster stability, security, and prosperity at home and in our region. Now, that seems to be at odds with the overall consensus of President Trump and how it will really impact the Caribbean region. I'm going to turn just quickly to ask the ambassador to come in and to give us his opinion from a CARICOM perspective to see how the policies will in fact likely impact our region. So Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I would want to go directly to trade, which of course has been a primary focus of declared US policy in the new administration of President Trump, and to identify where those policy shifts may need to be addressed by the region collectively. First, the shift in trade policy has been very clear. It's focused on the use of tariffs primarily for economic and national security objectives, to rebalance what is perceived by the new administration to be an imbalance in global trade against the United States, and a reset of the low US import tariffs overall. All three of these objectives have to be followed closely by all US trade partners, and in particular the Caribbean. The Caribbean community, of course, sees the US as its major trading partner. So any shifts in trade policy have to be given very serious consideration. And so I would want to perhaps move on, Sandra, to look at it in terms of what are the implications if any of these particular measures are deployed in a way that would affect trade with the Caribbean.
Please do, Ambassador. Interestingly, you've summed it up really well, and I think that what you're describing around trade, it seems as though, I mean, we accept the region, we're huge consumers of US products and services. So when we're looking at the immigration policies now, so it's been all over the news, everyone's discussing the fact that they are suggesting that any persons that are undocumented in the US or have any sort of criminal past should be returned to their respective countries. So do you feel that there might be some kind of play there where if you want to continue to trade with us, you have to take back what's yours? We've seen it happen, of course, with Colombia. Do you feel that that may be a risk for the Caribbean region?
While this takes me, of course, out of my particular sphere, the deportation of migrants to the US who are not in status has been going on for a very long time. And what appears to be changing is the scale and scope of the processes that the US will deploy to deport people it deems illegal or undocumented within its territory. The region, I think, has always received its nationals when they are returned, and I cannot see that there would be a difficulty where the proper procedures for return are followed. One, you have to ensure that whomever is being returned to you would be a national of your own country. But I would want to pause there by saying that the key issue would be following the proper procedures for returning nationals in accordance with US law, and of course respecting the nation of return and the conditions that they will set for receiving.
Thank you, Ambassador. Prof. Sachs, I'm going to jump back over to you now and ask you a couple of questions, because I know we have a limited time with you, and I really want to ask you around looking at climate change and sustainability, looking at the impact now of Trump's policies. How do you think the impact of that is going to affect not just globally, but of course the Caribbean region? Because we've seen a withdrawal from the World Health Organization. just help us with looking at all of these efforts. And of course, you are a champion of sustainability, a champion of climate change. And we are really feeling the impacts of that here in this region significantly. And with the change in policies, even the removal of paper straws now, we've gone back to plastic in the US. How do you feel now that those policies that President Trump's brought in is now going to really have an effect on the region from a climate change perspective?
You know, the tragedy is that the climate change has dramatically accelerated. The damages are profound. We see Los Angeles burning before our eyes, and our political class fails to connect the dots at all. We see the massive increase of Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes hitting the Caribbean and hitting the United States. And again, our political class doesn't connect the dots. Trump, of course, is a disaster in this regard. He loves money so much and immediate, easy wealth so much that for him, he cannot understand why you wouldn't pump all the oil and gas you possibly can. That's his most basic understanding. That's money, that's wealth, that's what I'm here for. And so he doesn't get it at all. Now, on the other side, the rest of the world does get it. So the U.S. Leaving, once again, the Paris Agreement is not going to stop the rest of the world from recognizing this emergency and continuing to decarbonize and to take actions. But we're awfully late in the day, and the United States will slow things. Even in the United States, by the way, we will continue to move towards a renewable energy system because even the oil-producing states are using solar and wind and so forth, despite anything that Trump or ExxonMobil or Chevron and so forth might say. For the Caribbean, it's not good, any of this, obviously. The Caribbean is just in the bullseye of all of this. Rising sea levels, more and more extreme hurricanes. This is what is unfolding right now. And the Caribbean needs extra help. And one thing I guarantee, there's going to be no help from the United States financially at all during the Trump period. That runs against every ounce of instinct of this president. Helping someone else? Why would I do that? I'm out to make money. So in this sense, the Caribbean's going to need to forge its alliances with the rest of the world. But my main message is, of course, don't give up or let the Trump rhetoric or even the Trump actions cause us to lose sight of the overwhelming global consensus that we're in a danger zone and we need to move forward. And we need to help countries like the countries of the Caribbean who are highly vulnerable to all of this face these risks. So there's a lot of diplomacy ahead, but it's not going to be with the United States. It's going to be with Europe. It's going to be with China. It's going to be with India. It's going to be with Latin America. It's going to be with Africa to forge a global consensus that someday the U.S. will rejoin.
Thank you, Prof. Sachs. And I was going to simply say it might be a motivator. Of course, we know that China and many other countries have invested heavily within the Caribbean and are there to support various initiatives, particularly around sustainability. And it's so important that we are not dictated to, if I say that, by Trump. And maybe we have some leverage to play there. If the US, as one of our closest trading partners and also supporters thus far, if they are not prepared to work with us, then of course the Caribbean has an option to go elsewhere and work with those who are of a similar mindset. So I know, Prof, you have joined us, and I know you are pushed for time. It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And I will see you very soon.
Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful session. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Prof. And members of the audience, we may have lost Prof. Sachs, but we have now gained one of our other panelists, who I understand is online now. And we have with us Professor, bear with me one moment, Professor Andy Knight. Can I ask, is Prof on with us?
Yes, good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Prof. I just wanted to share a little introduction to everyone. Prof. Andy Knight is a distinguished scholar in international relations, currently serving as a professor in the political science department of the University of Alberta. He has held significant leadership roles, including the director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago, and co-founding the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean. As co-editor-in-chief of both the African Security Journal and the International Journal, Professor Knight contributes to leading academic discourse and has recognised as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and he has been honoured amongst Alberta's top 50 most influential people by Venture magazine, and received the Harry Jerome Trailblazer Award from the Black Business. So, Prof, thank you so much for joining us. And I don't know if you've had an opportunity to listen to the conversation so far. And we have, of course, Ambassador Owain McCook joining us here. And I'm going to now bring in Principal Robinson to also join part of that conversation. And to say that Prof. Knight, President Trump has been in office since January. He's changed an awful lot. Can you tell us a couple of things that you would say, certain policies that he has brought into play at this moment in time that will have a significant impact on the Caribbean region?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry to be a little late getting in. We are quite a few hours behind you, so I think we got a little mixed up with the time. But Trump's engagement with international organizations is what I have the most concern about. Obviously, Trump has an American first strategy that has led to a deliberate rollback of U.S. engagement with institutions such as the United Nations. And we heard just now the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, etc. The U.S. has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, criticism of the World Health Organization during the pandemic, skepticism about the World Trade Organization's dispute resolution mechanism. These are things that we have to be concerned about. These moves are not just administrative moves. They symbolically undermine the multilateral framework that has governed global relations since 1945. And I have a thesis that what Trump is doing really is to try to weaken the international system and the world order that the United States was, in fact, responsible for creating back in 1945 with the help of the British and the Allied powers after World War II. And what is happening, I think, is that we're witnessing right before us an interregnum. This is our sort of a period of chaos and flux and turbulence and uncertainty that really characterizes a shift from one world order to the next. And that shift, I think, we saw it started probably around 1989, 1990 with the end of the Cold War, but Trump has really sped up or accelerated that shift with his American first approach. And he's doing so by undermining what I call the multilateral pillars of global governance. This not only affects global institutions like the UN, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, but also weakens regional organizations like CARICOM. So the Caribbean, situated, of course, in the region of increased strategic competition between China, Russia, and the United States, I think has to adopt a diversified and resilient diplomatic strategy in dealing with Donald Trump. We have to recognize that the current interregnum as a period of potential renewal can also lead to the Caribbean nations having some leverage in this uncertain time to drive innovative partnerships, to have different alliances, alliances that may or may not include the United States in the future. And I think we are starting to begin to see that happening right now. I think the Trump policies, if I may end here, is that the Trump policies, I think, may contribute to short-term instability. They also provide an opening for Caribbean states to redefine their role on the global stage and craft a new narrative that not only counters the erosion of multilateralism, but also paves the way for a much more equitable, resilient regional order. And I think there's no one that exhibits that kind of optimism right now for the Caribbean than Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, who, as you know, is heading CARICOM right now. And I think in every one of her speeches, if you listen to her carefully, you'll see that she is not going to kowtow to the Trump's bullying at the international level. She will actually find a way to strike back and to use the collective global South as a means of reshaping the policies that will be right now in the short term lead to instability for us. And hopefully in the long term, as we sort of reshape global order, small states of the Caribbean can start to punch above their weight again and actually create a world order that's much more suitable to us. So I'm going to leave it there for now, but I think this sort of is an opening for understanding that the broader context in which we find ourselves, and not to be too concerned about what Trump is trying to do in terms of the many different things that he puts on the agenda. He loves being in the news. He loves to say very outrageous things. The question is, can he really deliver on some of these things in a way that would be detrimental to us? And those are the things that we need to focus on.
Thanks, Prof. And Ambassador, I'm going to come over to you following what Prof. Knight's just said. And we clearly see this narrative around America first. Being part of CARICOM, should we now be framing our own Caribbean first strategy in response?
Thank you very much. I think the question of me first is a matter of degrees, because you define your diplomatic policies by national interest. So I think at a basic level, each country, each community looks to advance its interests, but normally it does so in a way that strikes a balance with the interest of others. It's not clear whether this approach to US national interest intends to seek balance or intends to project power above everything else. I think the previous speakers have spoken more broadly to this aspect, and I would want to perhaps bring the focus to what are the potential risks. And I would put it in two frames. The first would be direct bilateral risk. And in respect of trade, I would look at the policies that I earlier mentioned, using tariffs in a particular way that is somewhat different from how they've been used before, but we're still looking at tariffs within the existing trade framework. It's not the US is not creating a new instrument. A tariff is the of a charge or a tax on imports. what the US policies, and I think Professor Knight would have made the point that it is important to separate actual policy measures from the pronouncements and the wider conversations that the president and others in the administrations will lead. What exactly does that boil down to in terms of a policy or a measure? So when you look at the call for reciprocal tariffs, on its surface, it seems as if it could undermine the entire framework of the trade system. Mm-hmm. The proof will be in the pudding. If indeed, for example, the approach to reciprocal is line by line, and that is very unusual. You tend to try to put tariffs to protect your priorities where you have particular products that need defense, and you lower them where you want things to come in. And usually that strikes a balance across the tariff lines. One would not expect that the reciprocal tariffs will be tit for tat and line by line. It would not be in the interest of those who are pursuing that policy. So the question for counterparts of the US would be, where are your tariffs particularly high? And are these in areas that are sensitive to the US in terms of its export or protection thrust? So I think the first would be for the region to examine what would that kind of exposure be on the bilateral side. The fact of the matter is that the region actually is one of those that has a deficit with the US. The US runs a persistent trade surplus, both with CARICOM as a region and with CBI beneficiaries as a group. So I think on that aspect, we need to be very alert to what could be the bilateral threats from the deployment of that policy. I think Prof touched on another area which is concerning to many, and of course occupying the attention of a lot of global thinkers: the WTO and the rules-based multilateral trading system. The region has always supported a rules-based system because in the absence of rules, power determines what happens. And given our circumstance, it's not to our advantage to be in a global framework where the rules do not matter. And so we would need to see where the policies of the US go in terms of the multilateral framework. The announcements in and of themselves do not signal a disruption of the rules per se. They suggest that this could happen if the policies are rolled out in a particular direction. So for example, if there's a global supplemental tax, yes, that increases the US tariff rates above its WTO bound rates, it would immediately undermine a fundamental pillar of the multilateral system. And connected with other things like the disruption of the dispute settlement system of the WTO, it could lead to the undermining of the multilateral institution for trade that Professor has mentioned. So I'd want to stop there just to point out that we would want to be looking in real terms of what are the consequences of the actions that are actually taken, while being alert but not necessarily responding immediately to the things that are said without a policy instrument to execute them. What is interesting about the way in which the trade policy has been rolled out is that much of it is linked to the actual trade authorities that the executive has. And so far, while there is a lot of noise, many of them are tracking the specific legal frameworks that guide the development of US trade policy. This is not to offer a view on whether the deployment of the policies are good or bad in a broader sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I do have a question from one of our viewers. And I think it's pertinent to have that question now. We were originally going to have a Q&A, but I think this is really good to have that now. So our viewer asks that while a glaring characteristic of Trump's presidency, there is a lot more involved than immigration matters. And they want to hear a little bit more about his policies on trade, given his America First approach. And I know that we've really covered a lot of what CARICOM and the Caribbean region's response should be about that. Now, the other question is how his trade policies will affect Caribbean nations trying to trade more in the North American market. And following from that, how difficult or feasible would it be to focus on other markets for trade and find alternatives to America's products? So I'm going to ask everyone in turn. Ambassador, you get a breather now. I'm going to jump straight in and say, Prof. Robinson, what's your view on this? And then Prof. Knight, and then Ambassador can come back. So Prof. Robinson, what do you think about the trade policies affecting the Caribbean market and how those nations will trade more with North America, and how feasible would it be to focus on other areas rather than just America?
Okay, thanks for that, Sandria. I think as the other panelists and speakers have alluded to, we are now entering into, in a more defined way, what I call a new multipolar era. It's a new multipolar world, and we have to make that rapid shift. But I don't think we should pretend that we can escape our geography. So trade flows are to some extent shaped by geography. So that's a factor that will affect the speed with which we can make certain shifts and the areas that we can shift into. And also the differentials in power relationships. I don't know that we necessarily have the liberty to take a side, so to speak, in this discussion. The US is still, it's close to us geographically. It's still a very powerful nation that can exercise leverage. I think what is critical at this point is for our leaders, our nation states, leaders at the business level, academic level, to really begin to embrace that mental shift towards that multipolar world where I think there's been a comfort. It's been a long-standing reality in terms of those trade relationships with the US. In some ways, many parts of our culture, we've had an America First outlook from our end in terms of when we look for trading partners and how we do business. So I think embracing that multipolar reality, and that we now as a region at the national level, corporate level, university level, organizational levels, that we now need to embrace that mental shift of the need to explore a variety of global relationships, because that is now the reality within which we are operating. And if we can embrace that mind shift, it may create a unique opportunity amidst the short-term challenges. I think this is going to be this has the potential to be very disruptive in the short term. But as we make that mental shift and pivot, that we now explore in a more meaningful way trade relationships deepening within CARICOM, within the CELAC region, and with other parts of the world. Whereas I think we've almost, many of us have instinctively had an America First approach. So I think if we can make that mental shift, it does present an opportunity to deepen intra-regional trade and as well as our trade with a greater multiplicity of partners.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much. Prof. Knight, I'm going to invite you in to comment on looking at how we're going to focus on other markets for trade and alternatives. Following on from what Prof. Robinson's just said about we having that mental state around, because of the geography, we're putting America first, we trade, it's closer, you know. How do we move away from that now? And how is that feasible?
Well, you know, one of the things I always tell my students is that where you stand on issues depend very much on where you sit. And I had the opportunity to sit in Trinidad as director of the Institute of International Relations for 3 years. And I really saw the possibilities that the Caribbean states have in terms of trying to diversify their supply chains, trying to explore alternative markets. And I think that this is a possibility. I mean, we tend to take the easy way out and say that we need to rely on this single supplier, the United States. But that's a very risky strategy to have. So I think one of the things that will happen because of Trump's policies is that it will probably cause Caribbean states to wake up to the possibility of exploring new markets, new suppliers to reduce their dependence on the United States. And I think the Canadian government is trying to do this right now. Mexico is also doing this. And they're all geographically close to the United States. But they're looking now at ways in which they become less dependent upon the United States as this so-called hegemonic power. I believe that the hegemony which the United States enjoyed since the 1940s to the present, that they are losing out on that particular power base, and other countries are starting to catch up. We can explore alternative markets, for example, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and I was pleased to see Prime Minister Mia Mottley speak to the African Union about developing closer relations between the Caribbean states and Africa. Africa is a huge continent and has about 60% of its population are young people. I believe that a lot will be said in the future about the 21st century being the century not of the United States any longer, but the century of Asia and Africa, because those countries are rising at the time that the United States may be falling. So I think exploring those markets is a very important step. But in order to do that, we have to strengthen our regional integration processes, our relationships with one another. Caribbean states can increase their bargaining power by reducing dependence on external markets, strengthening the regional institutions that we currently have in CARICOM. We can facilitate greater trade cooperation and coordination, I think, if we do that. So that would be the strategy I think we ought to adopt. I know it's a risky strategy, but I think it's something that it's about time that we start doing that and becoming less dependent on the United States.
Thank you, Prof. And I think that what you said there is it's whilst many people, and we've heard comments about these policies being almost like hot air, because in reality, as the ambassador says, all of those working in the background will probably temper what the actual meaning or impact of those policies are going to be. But I think that what you've brought out here, and I think that's important, I'm going to ask Ambassador McCook to discuss, is looking at this trade cooperation and coordination of CARICOM. You're best seated, shall I say, in that space to look at how that infrastructure is at the moment. And what's your comment on that, Ambassador? Do you feel that we're ready? Do we have that infrastructure in place so that we can start looking at trading more significantly with Asia and Africa, or do we have a little bit more work to do? I'm not sure. I think we've frozen a little bit. Ah, you're back, Ambassador. Wonderful. So yes, I want to keep you in the hot seat, by the way. I wasn't going to let you escape just because we had a slight technical glitch. So yeah, I want to see CARICOM's position on this.
Okay, thanks. Everyone knows that the CARICOM trade in goods regime is a mature regime. It's been with us from Carifta through different iterations. So even before these new challenges, the question of deepening the single market, strengthening the single market, reducing intra-regional trade barriers, non-tariff barriers, that is, was a priority. My sense is that the community will deepen its resolve to strengthen its internal market, not just in keeping with its plans that were deployed before, but with more urgency in order to better navigate the challenges. I think other speakers have also mentioned diversification of our trade relations. The fact is that our most expansive trade arrangement is with Europe, the European Economic Partnership Agreement, coinciding also with the UK Economic Partnership Agreement. The bilateral trade agreements we have, most of them are with neighbors in our region, and we are right now in the middle of negotiating the updating of our agreement with Colombia. The fact of the matter is that the rules can only do so much. It's really firms that trade. And right now, any firm can look at anywhere in the world and say, I would want to expand my exports into that market. The challenge, of course, is that you have logistics, you have barriers in those markets as well. And it's in removing those barriers through trade arrangements or trade agreements that we can support our firms in looking wider afield to expand Caribbean exports into the rest of the world. So I think the challenge that you've laid out calls on us to, one, deepen the internal market, strengthen the performance within it, and diversify our partnerships in trade arrangements, whether it is looking to South America, elsewhere in Latin America, or to Africa, deepen our relations with the European Union, and of course, preserving our trade arrangements and trade relationships with North America.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I think it raises a very important one. And I think certainly our viewers, and judging by their questions, they're very keen on looking at putting the Caribbean first. And that is really a heavy reliance on CARICOM, certainly, to try and facilitate that. So, heads of government are meeting this week. So, I'm going to ask each of you to say, looking at our trade, what advice would you give to our heads of government that are meeting this week in respect of their united response to Trump's policies on trade? And I don't know, who do I want to jump in at this? I quite like this, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Ambassador's looking at me nervously. Prof Knight, I'm going to start with you. Lay down the gauntlets.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned the meeting coming up. I have also a meeting with the Foreign Minister of Barbados to talk about ways in which Barbados can actually navigate this very difficult period we find ourselves in. So I'm thinking along those lines as well. Developing strategic partnerships is extremely essential at this moment. And when you think, I'm glad the ambassador mentioned the European Union, because I think the partnerships that we have with the European Union and also with Canada, I think can provide access to new markets and technologies. I would recommend, in fact, that the leaders of Caribbean countries start to think very seriously about developing those partnerships with, or continue to develop those partnerships with the European Union and with Canada. I know that there are a number of initiatives happening right now in Canada for Canada to sort of diversify away from the United States, become less dependent on the United States. So this is a moment, I think, that Caribbean states should take advantage of this particular period and try to see how we can cement that partnership with Canada, for example, and with the European Union. I also think that there is a new area that we haven't talked about yet, I don't think, in the discussion so far, but the whole issue of digital trade. Digital trade, I think, provide new opportunities for Caribbean states to diversify their trade relations. And I think this is a way that we could begin the discussion about investing more in digital infrastructure and developing e-commerce platforms and so on to help businesses reach new markets, new customers, and so on. I know that geography matters, and I've heard this before, and I think this makes it easier for us to want to deal with the United States since we are in the backyard of the United States. But I think in the area of digital trade, there's an opportunity for us to not to be so bound to the geography and to be able to explore the possibility of creating the kind of commercial platforms that are necessary for businesses to thrive in new markets and to gain new customers that might be in Asia, might be in Europe, might be in China. And I can still remember when Xi Jinping came to the Caribbean, to Trinidad. I think it was one of his first visits to outside of China when he became president of China. He was talking about the possibility of expanding Chinese relationships with the Caribbean. And I think the so-called Belt and Road Initiative that used to be
Yes.
in Africa and Europe and so on, that Belt and Road Initiative has really come to the Caribbean as well. So I think we have to be cognizant of that and try to see how we could take advantage of the Chinese largesse and their willingness to invest in infrastructure, to invest in our businesses, and help to grow our businesses as well. Because China has taken a slightly different approach than the United States in many respects, dealing with Global South. Is one of partnerships as opposed to trying to act as though that we are somehow subservient to the Chinese. I know there's some criticism about some of the things that the Chinese government has done, but I think this is an opportunity for us to diversify away from the United States by encouraging a better relationship with China.
Thank you, Prof. And I know that the Belt and Road Initiative, it has worked in some parts, and there's been many criticisms of that Belt and Road Initiative. And those critiques often sort of, if I summarize, talked about the backdoor entry into some mechanism of control when it comes to those governments. And that's something that we here at CARICOM would want to avoid, should I say that. But I asked that, and I'm going to move on now to Ambassador. Are we jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, when I say from the US to China, when we look at what our leaders should really be considering as our response to Trump's policies?
I think it's the Barbadian statesman who had said famously, "Friends of all and satellites of none," and it would redound, I think, to the policies of the wider region. I don't know that we should posit this as a choice between over the years build partnerships based on mutual interest, and I think that this will continue. I would go back to the question you asked originally. What might be some of the CARICOM focused measures that we should consider going forward? And certainly, Prof. Knight mentioned digital, and not just digital trade, because the digital sphere covers a whole range of things. And there is, at the moment, a concerted effort, coordinated, of course, under the leadership of Prime Minister Mitchell of Grenada, to look at the region's digital strategy with an eye to the future. In terms of the diversification of trade, that is already a focus, as I mentioned. The updating of our trade regime. We have just completed a review of our common external tariff and rules of origin and hope to implement the updated system in the coming year. So I think in
I hope we haven't lost you entirely, Ambassador. We have a frozen moment. Prof. Robinson, I'm going to bring you in at this point until we can get Ambassador back. What would your advice be then to our leaders meeting this week?
It's the month of February, so
Is it the month of love?
I'm thinking a little dose of Bob Marley would be important. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. I think this is a critical moment to really emancipate ourselves from the world that we have taken for granted. As a financial historian, I'm very aware from my own studies that the world didn't always look like the post-1944 world. Humanity has experienced, for most of humanity, we've had a multipolar world. So our leaders, I think, need to make that mental shift, have that mental emancipation, that having a US-dominated global system is really not ordained. Okay, that was suited the US for a particular period of time. So we need to be prepared to make that mental shift. I also really think it's important that as we approach it, however, we have to be pragmatic in making that shift. And I think Errol Barrow, as mentioned by the ambassador, summarized what our strategic dance should be. Friends of all, satellites of none. And so we need to take that approach. And I think very importantly, though, and Andy, Prof. Knight mentioned it, if we are to make that shift in our supply chains, our trading partners, and so on, because of the reality of geography, we need to prioritize that digital transformation, the ability to make online payments using a variety of platforms, freeing ourselves from the tyranny of that banking system that goes through SWIFT. The rest of the world has really jumped past that stage, but the Caribbean is still very much wedded to that traditional form of commerce. So I think we need to make that shift to deepen intra-regional trade, trade with other parts of the world, diversify our supply chains and looking for opportunities. But to enable that shift, we have to prioritize that digital transformation. Otherwise, it will just be talk because we need to escape that geography and the digital technologies allow us to make that escape.
Thanks, Prof. And Ambassador, we did lose you, so I asked Prof to step in to continue the conversation in that sense. But I do have a question for you from one of our viewers, which has asked that what immediate interventions does the region need to make to accelerate diversity in relation to our trade with other regions, such as Africa and South America? And they've described this as two regions, that remain unexplored but ripe for trade with our region. So what immediate interventions would you suggest there, Ambassador?
I think the conversations regarding trade with Africa have been ongoing. Yes. We've had now 3 Africa-Caribbean trade and investment fora coordinated by Afrexim Bank, trying to match CARICOM investors, traders with African counterparts. It is a real challenge to pursue and realize the goal of enhanced trade with Africa, but it's an effort that will need to be prioritized. In doing so, I think we all are focused on the logistics challenges. And it's a chicken and egg situation. Of course, if you had more products move and people moving between the continent and or region, then you'd have more airlift and of course, cargo capacity. And so trying to put the cart before the horse before the cart is a big question. How do we get the connectivity with the continent that would allow trade to flow? We've been painfully used to the triangular nature of the connection through a metropole like as was the case with Europe. How to break that pattern and make direct trade connections possible, I think, is a real challenge that we have to grapple with, both at the level of the public and private sector. With respect to Latin America, that is a work in progress. As I mentioned earlier, we're already negotiating an updated agreement with Colombia. But agreements can only do so much. When you have market access, that makes, on paper, it makes trade easier. But in practice, what I mentioned earlier about improving our supply side capacity, the competitiveness of our producers, is critical to making that work. So we have to work on both angles, improving market access, but equally strengthening our competitiveness and our supply side capacity.
Thank you, Ambassador. Prof. Knight, I was just looking at answering this question around Africa and specifically South America that our viewer was intrigued about. How do we accelerate that diversity into those regions? I know the Ambassador has just told us about, there have been a number of sort of Afro-Caribbean summits taking place to discuss this. There are obviously challenges with logistics in respect of this. What would your suggestions be for the acceleration of this trade, shall I say, with Africa and also with South America?
Well, especially with Africa, I think we're beginning to see signs that we're moving in that direction with a CARICOM AU series of meetings that will happen from now on. I think we begin to see that possibility being established. But I think that's where we have to look next, is the big continent of Africa. There is a desire on the part of many African leaders now to try to find a way to remove their dependence from the United States and to engage in what's called global South-South relations and global South-South trade. And that would include, of course, Latin America and the Caribbean as well. I don't think we've done enough as a collective group of nations in the Caribbean to pursue that option. And I think that partly because of the laziness of having to deal with the United States because it's closest and because of the kind of largesse that we've managed to enjoy for some time in that relationship. But now that that's changing and it's quite clear that the Trump administration has a completely different view, I think we need to also look at these other options. And it begins with, of course, diplomatic relations, increasing the numbers of meetings and collaborations that will exist between Caribbean states and African states and Latin American states. So I think that's one of the areas. One of the things I wanted to bring into this discussion, because I don't think we have dealt with it enough so far, and that is the Trump's immigration policy that could affect the social, how should I put it, the social equation within the Caribbean, particularly if he's going to be deporting individuals from the United States to the Caribbean. As we see now, there's an agreement now to send deportees from the United States into Guyana. And Guyana seems to be willing to explore that option. I think the Caribbean as a community needs to develop a coordinated strategy of dealing with these deportees coming into the region. For one thing, if you're bringing in individuals who can contribute back to the countries that they were from, that's one thing. But if you're going to bring in individuals who are engaged in crime and so on in the United States that can set up the same kind of crime networks in the Caribbean, I think that would be a real challenge for the social well-being of the region. So I think we have to be very careful about that and think about how we're going to navigate that particular area, because this is definitely one of the troubling things. It can have a positive impact in terms of if these individuals
Indeed.
contribute to the economies of the Caribbean, but it can also have a negative impact if they are going to be bringing in guns and crime into the region. So that's something we should think seriously about.
Agreed, Prof. And I think that you've, if I say this, hit the nail on the head, is that there are clear benefits to those returning, but there are also significant disadvantages if they, for example, were criminals and then returning them to the region, and the challenge of dealing with that. And with the numbers potentially being so high, how do we now as a region manage that? Because just looking at the numbers that were released, we're talking in the thousands. And do we here at the region then respect the fact that they had gone through the criminal process, they were found guilty? What do we do now when they come back into our particular region in respect of that? How do we now have to facilitate that with the already overburdened prison services that I'm sure that many of the regions have to deal with on a daily basis? Before we move on, and I know, Prof, we want to look at the immigration part, I do have one question from a viewer here that should Caribbean countries join the BRICS currency? And I'm going to throw that. Ambassador's smiling at me. I like the wry smile there. So yes, I'm going to hand that one to you.
We do know that, for example, CARICOM has not approached certain aspects of the single economy,
Yes.
including a monetary union. So I don't know that talking about shifting to a particular reference currency other than the ones currently used. And of course, while the Eastern Caribbean has a monetary union, the rest of the region has individual, of course, central banks running their own monetary policy. So I don't know that I would be in a position to respond clearly to a question as to the region choosing to move to a BRICS currency or any other currency at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof. Robinson, what's your view on that? Should we join the BRICS currency?
I would approach that again through the lens of friends of all, satellites of none, being pragmatic, multiple partnerships. So what I would support and what I think is actually essential if we are going to make this shift to diversify our source markets, our trading partners, our supply chains, is that we need to facilitate alternative payment systems. So for example, digital payments, online payment platforms, M-Pesa and others are really quite dominant in Africa. If you go to Asia again, there's very little use of cash. The online payment platforms are critical. So I don't think so far we've sort of betted on the dollar and we've been linked to the dollar. I don't think our strategy is to shift to some alternative currency, but to have a framework that allows alternative payment systems so that we are not so tightly wedded to any one particular currency, because these shifts are going to come. And I think what is important, I think, From my perspective, in terms of the shift in the Trump policies, I don't think we should see this as an aberration and something that we link so much specifically to President Trump. President Trump had a previous term as president, and his policies and ideas that he campaigned on in his first campaign and the way he tried to govern. He spent 4 years out of government. Now he's back. It's the same policies, and he is one with quite an overwhelming majority. So I think it's important for us to internalize this as a shift in the United States. That this is a significant political force in the United States that has the capacity to shape their policy for the foreseeable future, and that we have to begin to adjust to it. But I think we have to have that friends of all, satellites of none. You don't want to move from one hegemon to another. We really want to have a diversified set of payment platforms. I think right now, the blockages to e-commerce, I'm very aware. I mean, I sit as a director of the Central Bank of Barbados, and we've been expending a lot of effort and capital trying to provide space for a number of these alternative payment platforms that are so diverse and that are going to be so critical if we're going to trade with different players.
Thanks, Prof. And I think what you've mentioned there is, of course, we have an example. We have CARICOM. We have an example of the EU, for example, and how they moved to a single currency. We've also seen the challenges that countries have felt, the potential attack on their sovereignty. And I think that looking towards that digital, alternative digital payment mechanisms will somewhat alleviate those particular challenges that faced those countries when Europe was, or the EU was being formed. So I think that we should really explore that area. And over to you, Prof. Knight. What's your view on this? Or does it differ from our other two panelists?
Not particularly, because I agree with everything that the ambassador said and Prof. Robinson has said. But I think we need to also take in consideration the potential risks that could be involved in shifting from a U.S.-dominated currency to a BRICS currency. Of course, BRICS currency could actually limit. Adopting a BRICS currency could actually limit Caribbean nations' ability to set their own monetary policies, and that again would obviously constrain their economic flexibility. And we want to be able to avoid that if we can. And we still don't know what the BRICS currency will do in terms of whether or not there will be currency volatility. That could actually impact Caribbean nations' economies if that happens. And also the dependence on BRICS economies. Countries in the Caribbean may become much more dependent on the economic performances of BRICS nations. And, you know, this is a bit of a risky thing, because if there are any economic downturns in that part of the world, in those countries that are members of the BRICS right now, that can have a negative impact on Caribbean states. So I think while the idea of joining the BRICS currency seems like a good potential alternative to the US currency, Caribbean states need to be very careful to consider the risks and the challenges involved, and to do a good assessment first before jumping on board that option. So I like Professor Robinson's caution about doing that. I think I agree with him 100%.
Thank you very much, Prof. We have another question that's come in from one of our viewers. Obviously, we've looked at the actions taken by Trump, and they said that many of those actions are likely to increase inflation. It will have the impact of expulsion of immigrants, tariffs on imported goods, and so forth. Now, of course, most of the imported goods of the Caribbean come from the USA. And the question is, should we expect central banks of the Caribbean to raise interest rates to deal with the imported inflation from the USA in the near future? So, Prof. Robinson, I'm going to kickstart with you on that, in your role as sitting on the board. Do you feel that that's going to have a significant impact on our interest rates?
Well, to the extent that the tariffs in particular, that they are imposed, you have countries reacting, then certainly it creates the potential for prices to rise, and we import a lot of that inflation. So a spike in inflation is certainly one of the major threats that the Caribbean would face if this tit for tat trade policy war, trade war went ahead. How do you fight imported inflation? Now, in the case of the Caribbean countries that have floating exchange rates, then central banks may well have to confront how do they raise interest rates to actually counteract that. The countries with fixed exchange rates, they don't really have that independence of monetary policy. But I think the jury is far from open. The jury is quite open as to whether increasing your domestic interest rates are really an effective tool to fighting that imported inflation. So it's not clear to me that that's actually an effective tool for our central banks. And it's certainly not one where you are running a fixed exchange rate regime.
Thanks, Prof. Prof. Knight.
I think the bigger risk for us...
sorry. There was a lapse. Yes, my apologies. Go on, Prof. Robinson.
I think the bigger risk for us is if there's inflation in the United States and the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to fight that inflation, that we then see a spike in the borrowing costs of Caribbean governments and firms, because a number of loans from IDB, wherever they are indexed to a floating exchange, to that floating rate. So I think the bigger risk is the surging borrowing costs. And we experienced that in the region 2 or 3 years ago. So I think these are some of the things that we may very well have to brace for.
Thank you. I was going to say, Prof. Knight, any additions to that? Then I'll come to you, Ambassador, for your view on that as well.
Well, I defer to Professor Robinson's advice. I think it's very, very good advice. I think that we need to be able to decide on how we're going to communicate this to our people. The possibility that there could be a spike in inflation, and how we can implement an inflation targeting strategy to deal with this. And I think central banks have a responsibility to focus on that, price stability, to communicate their inflation objectives very clearly to the public. And also, I think to start to forecast a little bit better how inflation can actually be reduced. Forecast the level of inflation that will probably happen as a result of Trump policies, and help central banks to anticipate and respond to inflationary pressures more effectively. I think these are the things that we could do. But I think that the whole issue of inflation is also not just a problem for Caribbean countries. There's going to be inflationary pressures in the United States as well. I think one of the things that I think the tariffs will do is cause a number of different sectors within the United States to be very concerned about inflation, the cost of things in the United States, and the impact that these things can have on the taxpayers in the United States, who will be bearing the brunt of the targeted tariffs and the change in the prices of goods and services and so on in the United States. So I would caution that we need to be able to be a little bit more careful about how we forecast the nature of the inflationary pressures, and then try to develop a strategy that's collective, that's Caribbean wide, and perhaps with some regional cooperation with other regional central banks to help address this common inflationary challenges that we are expected to have. I think that's the point I would make here, in addition to what Professor Robertson has said.
Thanks, Prof. Knight. And I'm going to say, Ambassador, I know we're on the precipice of time, and I note that. So I just wanted for you to come in just to express an opinion, certainly around whether we would expect interest rates, all the Caribbean banks here, to increase interest rates to deal with the imported inflation from the USA.
I would join in deferring to Professor Robinson on this particular matter. But more broadly, I think that the part of the response to the challenge of exported inflation from the US to the Caribbean would be, what are alternative sources of supply of goods that would otherwise be imported from a higher cost source? And indeed, the 25 by 25 intended to bring back to regional supply and purchase products that were being imported in large numbers, much of those products, of course, from the US. So I think, while differing on the question of the monetary and fiscal policy responses, I would say that trying to ensure that the region has other
Ambassador, I think we've lost you again. Technology, we are trying, but I would just say thank you all very much. I know we have come to a close, and I was going to invite, I'm not sure if Professor Robinson wishes to close or wishes me to close in this matter, but I first of all want to thank everyone.
Yeah.
Sorry?
I'm saying I'm going to leave the closing to you as
Thanks
our very able moderator.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say, Ambassador, our connections are going and our time is there. I was saying thank you so much to absolutely everyone that's participated today. It has been a very rich discussion. And I would hope that it's a very important one, very pertinent now with the heads of government meeting this week. I hope that they would have an opportunity to certainly listen to the expertise that we have pulled together for today's Vice-Chancellor's forum. And I would say that looking at all our trade policies, we've explored our economies, our immigration that is inextricably linked, if I would say that, to our economies, and looking at all the changes that could potentially affect our families. The security aspect of this is also going to be very important. And let's not forget the ongoing geopolitical chess game. But as I did comment earlier, are much of President Trump's policies hot air? Because effectively, when we look at our diplomacy, once it's said out there, we've heard about his attraction to social media, being in the news all the time. The reality is there's a huge team of people underneath that, aren't there, who are going to have to actually try to figure a way out through our diplomacy channels to continue to interact with the rest of the world. And that is one thing that certainly we should be considering as an entire region through CARICOM. And I'm going to say we're not just a spectator in global affairs. We are small, or we may be small, but we're certainly mighty in both intellect, as we've seen here in our forum today, diplomacy and adaptability. So we have, as we have heard from our Vice-Chancellor, we have survived colonialism, structural adjustment programs and global recessions. So what we want to do here is we want to stay informed. We want to remain engaged with everyone within our region, and we want to continue to advocate fiercely for our interests. Thank you all very much. Thank you to those online, and wishing you a very pleasant remainder of your day. Thank you very much.